And folks, if you're just joining us, we're speaking with Hugh Segal today. Hugh Segal was Chief of Staff for Brian Mulroney. He's Senator Hugh Segal. We're sitting here at Queen's University quite comfortably, I must add, having a wonderful chat about all things Canadian, and his new book is called The Right Balance. There you go. You can hold it up and show the people if you want. There you go. Which is easy way to get it as always, folks. www.brenthollandshow.com. Just click on the book cover or Hugh's picture. Will take you right to a place where you can order it from the comfort of your own home. Hugh, I want to welcome you to the show and thank you for joining us this afternoon.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
Thank you, sir.
Always glad to talk to a former Montreal.
It's funny, you know, I just had Barb Kay on, National Post columnist, and I'm not dropping a name, I'm just identifying a person, and we were talking about bagels and Fairmount, and you grew up in that, kind of in that area.
Oh yeah, and look, I have seen serious life-threatening arguments over bagels, and there are folks who, you know, grow up in Toronto and think Torontonians know about bagels. They think the Maple Leafs know how to play hockey. And the historical evidence is very clear that Torontonians aren't able to either make good bagels or play professional hockey. And that's just one of the burdens they had. Otherwise, they're lovely people, and some of my best friends are Torontonians, but they don't really understand that difference. And the Montreal bagel, now there is a little bit of a, as you will know, distinction between the St. Viateur bagel and the Fairmount bagel, but it's not a large one. It is only for the intense aficionados. I am actually able to cope with both. And as a parent, have done too much of that over my 60 years of life and living.
And there we have it, folks. Hugh Segal, who is known for his unbiased comments around the world, but he has a definite bias towards bagels and the Habs, as do I. So we do share something there, Hugh. Let's jump in right away, shall we? You were Chief of Staff for Brian Mulroney, as I said at the outset, between February 1992 and April 1993. And in Brian's book, he praises you up and down. He said, every day, Hugh Segal amazed me. He was performing miracles on a daily basis, and he was a star Chief of Staff. That's right in his book, by the way. That's a direct quote.
Well, it was a great privilege to work for him. He was probably the most courageous and determined Prime Minister I ever came across. And I'd had the privilege of working as a Chief of Staff to Premier Davis in Ontario for so many years, and as a Cabinet Secretary for him. I had the privilege of working for Bob Stanfield, for whom I had great respect and affection. But in terms of determination and courage to face tough issues, and to do it in a way which reflected what I would call a very balanced conservative view of the country, I think Mulroney probably shot the lights out and took great risks. You know, what tends to happen when you fight for change, as he did on the free trade agreement, on NAFTA, when you fight for change in terms of trying to bring Quebec into the Constitution, something which had been urged upon him by provincial premiers when Quebec elected a federalist government under Monsieur Bourassa, and even something as structurally important as to bring our tax system into the modern age with a consumption tax, the GST. Those always produce huge pockets of people who are forever opposed and intensely disaffected as a result. And while the vast majority of the population or a plurality of the voters were in favor, or else he wouldn't have been successful with, for example, free trade, the people who were opposed stay opposed. They don't change their view. The people who are in favor go on with their lives, and it's not a driving force in their life. And that, of course, produced, you know, huge pressures in terms of his popularity. At one point, when I was in his employ, I think we were down to 7% in the polls, which meant at that moment in time, more Canadians believed Elvis Presley was alive and well than were planning to vote for us. But that didn't deter him. He made the decision, I think, early on in his prime ministership, that he's here to do the things that are important structurally for Canada. That was his mandate. And if he pays a personal political price, he's prepared to do that. And history will show that he did. But now, whether it's on the environment, whether it's on trade relations with the United States, whether it's the way in which Canada engaged in Gulf War I, for example, or engaged in support of ISAF relative to Bosnia-Herzegovina and stopping the carnage in that part of the world, he gets pretty good marks. And those of us who were part of...
Apartheid as well?
Indeed, apartheid very much so. And now when you visit Marlborough House in London, the degree to which Canada's role on the anti-apartheid fight and the Prime Minister's leadership at the time is held in high regard is truly very, very compelling. So for me, who was one of, I think, of his 7 or 8 chiefs of staff over 9 years, I just felt very, very fortunate to have an opportunity to be a very small player in what was a very broad vision of Canada and the world.
Can you take us into the Prime Minister's office, the PMO, for some of those crucial decisions that were going on behind the scenes? Obviously, you were championing his cause for the new Confederation. I've got that wrong.
The new Constitution and Charlottetown Accord
yes,
and all that,
yes,
yeah?
Yes.
Well, let me give you a specific event in history which Canadians will remember, and I'll give you some sense of what transpired. The event was the counter-coup, the communist counter-coup against Gorbachev in Russia.
Yeah, I remember
So the information that filters out is that he's being held in house arrest, Gorbachev and his family, that the communists are trying to take power. There are troops deploying in downtown Moscow, and it's unclear where the situation is going. This Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, had a view: always wake me up if it's happening in the middle of the night. Don't worry about whether I can handle being woken up. I can handle being woken up. The mistake is not to tell me. So he was woken up, and he asked that all the senior people from Defense and Foreign Affairs be at a meeting, I think at 8 o'clock sharp, in the Cabinet office in the center block of the House of Commons, and that he would want to get a full briefing at that time. Unbeknownst to anybody, including myself, he did not then go to bed. He got up, and through the use of the Prime Minister's switchboard, which is almost akin to the White House switchboard in terms of being able to reach everybody anywhere, anytime, he began to develop his own frame of reference as to what was going on. Sadly, our ambassador to Moscow, who's a great guy, was on his first holiday in 4 years, on I think a bicycle trip through Belgium at the time. So he wasn't on the ground. Other officials were. Our Prime Minister got on the phone. He spoke with the American ambassador. I think he spoke with the British ambassador. I think he spoke with other military folks. He spoke with people in Russia whom he had met on various trips in the past and who he knew from the business and political world. He spoke to the White House. He spoke to allies in France and other countries who had, were real time because of the same time zone, and got all this data. And then arrived at 8 o'clock to be briefed by the officials. And I don't want to be unkind about our officials. I think they've been all up all night working very hard. But there wasn't much that they told our Prime Minister that you wouldn't have gotten from watching CNN or downloading the news services. And that may have been because they had no way to penetrate the veil of what was going on. After they finished, he then briefed them on what was going on. It was one of the great moments as I watched all these guys who had come to brief the Prime Minister and all of us to take notes actually began to take notes as the Prime Minister briefed them on what he had heard from various sources much closer to the events on the ground. And I remember him saying that, I'm trying to think now, the president who followed Gorbachev was Yeltsin. He said, I remember him saying in that meeting, Boris Yeltsin will be fundamental to this process. If he engages on the side of democracy, democracy will be saved. And if he doesn't, we will be in some difficulty. And Yeltsin, to his credit, made the right decision, a very courageous decision at the time, stood out on top of a tank and let people know where he stood. And that became a very important tipping version. And some years later, when Yeltsin was in Washington on business, he did a stop in Canada on the way home, on the way over the pole, for a working dinner at 24 Sussex. And you could see that the relationship that Prime Minister Mulroney had built with Yeltsin had become very, very fundamental. And Canada was, as listeners and viewers may not know, next to Germany, the highest per capita contributor to transformation, change, nuclear decommissioning, economic growth, and all the rest in Russia, in the old Soviet Union. And to be fair to Prime Minister Chrétien, when he accepted nuclear waste from nuclear submarines that were being decommissioned, he continued that tradition. trying to assist the Russians in this process of modernizing and moving from an enemy state to an economic partner and a significant power, not focused on ideology but on economic opportunity for their own people.
Folks, by the way, we're speaking with Hugh Segal this afternoon. We're doing this, we're taping it at Queen's University in his office, where he is a faculty member of the Policy Studies faculty. His new book is called The Right Balance. So you can get it at www.brenthollandshow.com. Just click on the book cover. As always, folks, we'll take you right to a place where you can get it from the comfort of your own home. And I do urge you all to get it. It's a fascinating, fascinating study of the right, if you will, conservatism. And that's where I'd like to go now. And just want to follow up. I always admired Brian Mulroney's leadership during the Oka crisis. As a matter of fact, coming up, Harry Swain will be on. And
wonderful.
I'm trying.
Public service.
This is another plug to try and get Brian on the show. Mr. Mulroney, if you are indeed listening, I am doing a special on Oka. I would love for you to come on and tell me your thought processes and share that with the students that are listening, as Mr. Segal has just done. Let's move on to your book. Right at the beginning of the book, you question what Sir John A. Macdonald would think of the Canada that he built, that he started. What do you think he would think?
Well, I think he would be impressed with some things, and he'd be bored to death with some others. He'd be impressed by how far we've come economically and socially, how his vision of one country from sea to sea has really taken root in a remarkable way, ranks us amongst the best countries in the world in terms of quality of life. I think he'd be proud that we are still a separate country, that we did not get sucked into the maw of the United States, that we maintain cordial, constructive, commercial, defense, and other relationships with our greatest ally, but we have maintained the British North America, the Quebec Act premise of who we are, what we stand for. I think he'd be delighted at that. But where I think he would be a little bit bored is with the fear of any grand vision, the extent to which politicians, center-right, center-left, left, right, etc., really seem to be fighting a battle of inches around various instruments, around existing policies, as opposed to saying, what are the big solutions we can try? What are the huge steps forward our society has the maturity to try and achieve? Because the story of his life, Sir John A., was to take really horrific challenges that nobody thought was possible and say, actually, men in those days, men of goodwill, now we'd say men and women of goodwill, if they're prepared to set aside their narrowness and their excessive partisanship, can pull things together. There's the wonderful story of the Leeds South by-election, where he got D'Arcy McGee, who led a Catholic-driven Reform Party which was opposed to him. They merged, they came together, and they campaigned together for that by-election in a way which put the two parties into the same process. It evokes, frankly, images of Stephen Harper and Peter MacKay putting two warring factions together so that Canadians would have one national Conservative Party, which they could either vote for or against, but they had a national option. Sir John A., I think, would be looking for that kind of more engaged vision and a bit more risk-taking, not around this approach to campaigning or that approach to fiscal policy, but around large solutions to problems which are very, very serious and which, if we don't address, will begin to consume us and diminish our quality of life and diminish the kinds of opportunities which we want our kids and grandchildren to have.
Absolutely. And I think Mr. Harper, just to modernize that, I know there's a lot of people listening now that will disagree with this, but I think he has that national vision towards the military. And to quote Mr. Crosby from several years ago, I am cheek to cheek, bum to bum with his views on the military without question.
Well, I think the great thing about Stephen Harper is that he has a really interesting political background. He began as a research assistant to a Conservative member of Parliament from Calgary, a Progressive Conservative member of Parliament, Mr. Hawke. And then after that, he worked for Deborah Gray when she got elected as the first Reform member. He was very much involved with Preston Manning in shaping the philosophical framework of the Reform Party. And I think I learned over the years, in my early days, when I saw what they were up to, I said, this is just a right-wing extremist operation. In fact, what they really were was an organization based on the philosophy of the West wants in. The West wants to have its votes count. They want its views about the importance of enterprise, the importance of smaller government, the importance of lower taxation to count, and not always to be overshadowed by the majority provinces, so to speak, of Quebec, Ontario, and the Maritimes. And he worked quite studiously towards that, and I think on balance, one of the things that united people on the furthest right of reform to the furthest left of the old Progressive Conservative Party was our common view that our common foe, the Liberal Government of Canada, was massively underinvesting in our defence forces, our defence capacity, our defence materiel, our strategic lift, our strategic reach. And Stephen Harper has addressed that. And, you know, for all the folks on the left, for whom I have great respect, who will say, that's all a waste of money. That could be spent on hospitals and schools. And the answer is, well, when two huge airlift jets purchased by the Harper administration, Government of Canada, can be in Haiti in 24 hours. Canadians can be first on the ground. The highest per capita engagement in support of Haiti after the earthquake. That tells you something in terms of humanitarianism that we could not do before those assets were in place. So it's a combination of both responsibility to protect. A liberal idea, not a bad idea, is completely meaningless without the capacity to deploy. And what Mr. Harper has given the armed forces, the men and women who do such an outstanding job and have done an outstanding without the right resources, he's given them the capacity to deploy. It still has to be increased in my judgment. We're well behind where a nation our size should be, but we're on the right path, and I give him great credit for that. And Mulroney believed in the same thing. He continued the shipbuilding program. The patrol frigates that are at the center of our Navy were ships that he brought along. The coastal patrol vessels, which are essential for the Naval Reserve and essential to protect our coasts, were ships that he commissioned. And that's a very important part of our capacity today.
It is always a great pleasure, folks. And my role in this is just to facilitate a conversation, but I always gain great benefit from speaking with people with passion and vision, and certainly our guest today is demonstrating that. Hugh Segal's our guest, by the way, folks. Brand new book out called The Right Balance, and I urge you all to go and get it. www.brenthollandshow.com. There you will find more information on our guest today, Senator Hugh Segal, Brian Mulroney's Chief of Staff. You've done so much, and I want to get into anti-terrorism afterwards as well, too. Nice to hear somebody speak so passionately and honest about how great Canada, this wonderful country of ours, is. You know, there's some wonderful quotes in this book, and I'm just going to grab one right here. History is not destiny, but how we respond to it does determine our future. Can we talk about that for a second?
Sure. Well, you know, we have a particular history in Canada in terms of how the country was put together. Section 92 of the Constitution, which says our provinces have uncommon jurisdiction. Many federations do not have their subnational units. The provinces have as much jurisdiction or power as ours do. There was a reason for that. The reason was that was the way to put a country together, respecting local differences, respecting local best practices, respecting the fact that a welfare program in downtown Calgary might not look or feel the same as a social assistance program in northern New Brunswick, and that the provincial government should have the freedom to vary that. That premise of how you deal with potential conflict by respecting people for who they are and where they live and giving them some freedom is a premise which, in my judgment, exists in a global basis. And if you think about Canada's foreign policy, whether we were working on the early days of the creation of the United Nations, whether we were working on the Charter for NATO, whether we were looking at the creation of the Human Rights Declaration of the UN, or whether we've been involved in circumstances like Cyprus or Mike Pearson in the Middle East, it was always about cutting people some slack to live their own lives, to have some measure of respect for who they were and where they lived, and looking for other options other than conflict.
Autonomy.
Autonomy. And you know, you think about it, Canadian troops, this will strike a lot of people as odd, but Canadian troops in our lifetime have deployed more directly to protect Islamic parts of the world.
That's right.
And Muslim our fellow human beings who happen to be in the Muslim faith, from Christians or others who had something bad in mind. We did so in Kosovo with our Air Force. We did so when we engaged for the purpose of liberating Kuwait with our other allies. And that's because we just take the view that people have the right, the people of Kuwait have the right to their own country, to their own way of life. And if the leader in Iraq at the time decides otherwise, we're prepared to engage on that. And I think that's an important principle. Canadians do not go to war to impose their will on other people. We have never been an imperial power. But when our principles or our allies are attacked, Canadians have always engaged and always done more than our fair share, and that's an important part of a long tradition which goes back to my Uncle Max, who's 86 years young, landing on the beaches of Sicily and fighting up the spine of Italy to help start a second front against the Nazis. So this is many Canadian homes have similar linkages to that remarkable past, and that is what should tell us what our core premises and principles should be going forward. And our response to today's challenges may be different in terms of the instruments and the mechanics, but the guiding principles come from our history, and I think we have to be true to that.
Agreed wholeheartedly. Folks, we're speaking with Hugh Segal this afternoon. We're live from Queen's University. His new book, The Right Balance. A lot of solid ideas in this book, folks. Ones that you'll probably gravitate towards because there's passion and vision behind these ideas. And that's what I like about this book. Here's another one, a great quote. That diversity, and he's talking about people, is compelling human resources, one which contributes to economic strength and vitality. And it's funny because I've always said, like most people, our best natural resource are our people. And there it is right there in black and white. Can we talk about that too?
Sure. The Quebec Act, historically, was the first time the British Empire, having won a piece of territory, decided to have, through legislation of the British Parliament, specific protection for people's language, culture, religion, civilization. French Canada, Quebec. That's a Canadian experience that happened here first, as opposed to anywhere else in the globe. And if you look at the evolution of Canada, we've always said that duality at the core of our diversity is the basis by which we can embrace and engage other diversity. And the notion that Canada was the first country in the world to recognize the free and independent Ukraine after it broke free of the Soviet Union is in large measure because we have a wonderful, vast Ukrainian population who are an integrated part of Canadian society. And a lot of our relationships around the world are based on the diversity of our population, its strength, its linkages, its capacity. The Indo-Canadian community is a very strong contributor to our national economic, social, and political life. And the fact that we are able now to build a free trade agreement with India, which negotiations have begun, speaks to the value of that. So multiculturalism, which may be under attack in some parts of Europe because they never understood it the way we understood it. They understood it, our German friends, by keeping Turkish workers as guest workers, living in Turkish parts of town, and never having any rights. People who came to this country, my parents, grandparents, and thousands of others, became permanent residents. They got their landed immigrant status. They worked their way to citizenship, and they became part of the family. There's a difference between saying, you're different, you live down in the basement, versus you are different, and you're part of the Canadian family table, and we're delighted to have you there. And as Diefenbaker said when he brought in the Canadian Bill of Rights, you put your shoulder to the wheel, we'll protect you from discrimination, we'll make sure you have your place with everybody else in Canadian society. That's a different approach to multiculturalism, and that makes us a strong country with linkages and ties all around the world which are economically productive and vital to our economic success.
Let me just ask you right away, many people are unaware that Mr. Diefenbaker brought in a Canadian Bill of Rights.
That's right.
Can we talk about that?
Well, I'm a member of the Conservative Party today. Because John
Doesn't make you a bad person.
Thank you. Because John Diefenbaker came to my school on St. Kevin Avenue in Montreal, 1962, before the 1962 election, to present a copy of the Canadian Bill of Rights to our principal. And that was a school filled with first and second generation immigrant kids, largely from Eastern Europe, and parents who are people who, by the way, always voted Liberal, just so we're clear, for a whole bunch of interesting historical reasons. And he said I could have used my mother's Scottish name, Bannerman, when I entered Canadian politics, but I stuck with Diefenbaker because I believed whether you had 6 syllables your name, whether it was Jones, Langlois, Mazenkowski, or Diefenbaker, if you put your shoulder to the wheel, this country had a place for you. And he said, that's what I'm saying to all of you here and to your parents. That's who we are. That's what the Canadian experience is. That's what this Bill of Rights signifies. And over time, a few court decisions, the Dry Bones case and others, which gave it some constitutional standing, then Mr. Trudeau, to his credit, did the Charter of Rights and Freedoms with the support of people like Bill Davis and Richard Hatfield, 2 other conservatives. And that's how we have the framework of freedom that we have in this country today. And it started with John Diefenbaker, for whom human rights was always central. And I'm delighted the present government has given out the first 2 John Diefenbaker Human Rights Awards, which recognize global struggle for human rights. One of the recipients is an old friend of mine, Asma Jahangir from Pakistan, who has fought for legal rights, women's rights, due process rights, gone to jail several times under Musharraf to defend those rights. I'm delighted my country would recognize her and her struggle in our Commonwealth sister of Pakistan, and do so with the John Diefenbaker Award, because it indicates that these values are not only meaningful to us, but we want to share them with other people around the world.
Folks, we're speaking with Hugh Segal this afternoon. We're live from Queen's University. His new book, The Right Balance, www.brenthollandshow.com. And as I look just over your shoulder, I just spotted Mr. Mulroney and yourself. I'm going to just zoom in there, folks.
He calls that photograph the confessional.
You got any stories you can tell us about Mr. Mulroney that aren't off color?
Well, only that, let me be really clear. People have this view of him as an individual who, associated with the high and mighty, and he was a very down-to-earth guy. When we would go, for whatever reason, to various cities, he'd much rather be outside a chip wagon, sitting with the guys, the laborers, and the cab drivers and the others, and shooting the crap over a bon stimé and frit than he would be at some, highly organized, high-end proposition. You have to do both in politics. It's the nature of the... But he was very down-to-earth in that sense. And while he became a person of global prominence and an outstanding prime minister about whom the country had strong views, pro or con, he never forgot his own roots as the kid of a hard-working electrician on the North Shore of Quebec. Didn't have much. Didn't have a lot of opportunity, and had to build everything he had by himself. And I always have a lot of time for the kinds of conservatives who understand that part of the struggle is helping others on the one hand, but also not forgetting where your own roots are and where you came from. You'll bump into people who think they landed on Earth in their present state of high standing and compelling social status, and the truth of the matter is the vast majority have not.
Folks, we're talking about The Right Balance, the new book by Hugh Segal, Senator Hugh Segal. In it, he describes conservative values, and that's where I want to go next, Hugh. Conservative values, do they differ a lot from, say, liberal values, socialist NDP values, or is it primarily everybody has the same basic goal and they're just taking different roads to get there?
No, I think they are fundamentally different.
Okay, let's...
Brent, I would say they're different in this respect. We don't believe as conservatives that government is the first or best solution to any problem. We accept that there'll be some problems so complex or so large that we all have to work together through government and our governments to find a solution. But by and large, our general bias is the local community, the small-time entrepreneur, the farmer, the person who's working in the forests or in the fishery, the small business person, the teacher in a classroom, has far more power to affect people's lives for the better than government does by definition. So we are always very careful about cookie-cutter solutions that come from the center and are imposed on different parts, which is why our friends in the Liberal Party probably would view themselves as the party of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is very noble, very compelling, we would view ourselves as the Charter of the British North America Act, which divided the powers between what the federal government should do and what the provinces should do. And we've always been much more prepared to support that division because we know that governments that are closer to the people, that are more influenced by their local voters and are not so remote will get it right more often than governments that are far away and have a huge bureaucratic structure and a massive regulatory base which gets in the way of being human and responsive. So that's one classic area where we would be very different. Another place we would be different, I think, is that we are really anxious about what might best be called tax and spend liberalism, because the notion that as long as you're raising enough taxes to cover all your costs and not have an excessive deficit, then you're doing the right thing, actually assumes that the right thing can only be done by government. That it's only government programs and government dollars and government decisions that matter in people's lives. And for the vast majority of our fellow Canadians who don't come into contact with government on a day-to-day basis, it's what goes on in their own life that really matters. And we believe that giving them the freedom to do so and getting out of their way is as important, if not more so, than designing a really thoughtful government program. I think our Liberal and New Democratic friends are a little less trusting of the forces of the marketplace. I don't think the forces of the marketplace are always operating in the public interest, but without those forces, there is no economic growth. There is no expansion of our economy. There's no generation of profits, which are fundamental for governments and everything else to exist. I think our Liberal friends are more of the view, with their NDP folks on the left, that government programs, government crown corporations, these are the answers to almost any possible problem, and I just don't think there's any evidence over time to sustain that bias.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly as a small business owner. The less government intervention, the better, in my viewpoint. Let the marketplace, to a certain extent, with guidance from the government. I mean, it's always nice to have help for exports, etc., etc.
Well, the government has a duty to make sure there's a level playing field. The government has a duty to make sure there are laws in place that keep predatory activity from oppressing people in the marketplace. Consumers have to have their rights respected. That's all quite legitimate. Having a basic safety net in terms of health care and education in place is vital. But it is important that we don't let the public sector soar to such a large size that nobody can afford to sustain it. And we have gone through cycles in our history when that has been part of our problem.
Agreed. Folks, www.brenthollandshow.com. Click on the book cover called The Right Balance, written by our guest this afternoon, Senator Hugh Segal. And Hugh, as you know, was Chief of Staff for Brian Mulroney. And the next one I want to tackle is anti-terrorism.
Right.
You're on the Committee for Anti-Terrorism.
That's right.
Can you enlighten us? Is this country at risk at this present moment?
The answer is we're all at risk. All of our allies in the Western world who espouse positions in support of cultural plurality and democracy and freedom and women's rights are on the enemy list of Al-Qaeda and other organizations of that kind, and their activities have not abated. They have become a bit more atomized in terms of how they're organized. The successful military activity in Afghanistan has taken away from them a central place, a country from which they can organize their attacks, but with the net and various other digital instruments at their disposal, we have to deal with issues that are real, like homegrown terrorism, the Toronto 18 who were arrested and dealt with by the courts, the need for our security and intelligence agencies to be involved in lawful obstruction of activities before they become dangerous for the rest of us. So it is a serious task, and our committee's work is to look at the relationship between the various security agencies, the sharing of information, to look at how other countries are doing it, to make sure we are benefiting from best practices elsewhere. We look at the issue of legislative oversight. The United Kingdom, Australia, Germany, France, the US have legislative oversight that's real time. Canada does not. We just have CERC, which takes a look at what CSIS does after the fact. So we look at a range of those issues. We've been doing some pretty extensive testimony on what are the factors contributing to homegrown radicalization, and how do we work constructively with various communities to get in the way of that, to keep that from becoming problematic. So we don't involve ourselves in operational activity. That's for the RCM police and the anti-terrorist groups and our major police forces. And all our major police forces now have anti-terrorist groups that are fully engaged and work together. But we have to be forever vigilant. It is when you the Mackenzie Institute, whose head came to appear before us, a very thoughtful and superb think tank leader on this issue, said the problem is when you don't have events that are frightening and scary and you become complacent, the complacency leads to vulnerability and becomes an opportunity for the forces of darkness. So we have to find that right balance between public protection and the protection of our way of life, our civil liberties, our freedom, our democracy, our freedom of expression on the one hand, and on the other hand, ensuring that we are doing what we have to do to keep Canadians safe, because national security, protection of Canadians and their day-to-day lives from intimidation, fear, or violent attack should be the first responsibility of all government. And certainly at the Anti-Terrorism Committee, the Senate, we take that responsibility very seriously.
Folks, I just want to mention too, I'd like to talk about Afghanistan now. Let's not forget the Taliban are still in and around in Afghanistan. What the Taliban do is they facilitate the opium trade. They are responsible for grabbing all that opium, which is 95% of the opium trade in Europe, and I think it's 90% in the rest of the world that they supply. Al-Qaeda brokers with the Taliban and supplies the logistics to get that opium out with organized crime. So every time you're doing illegal drugs, folks, if you're listening right now, you are contributing to international terrorism.
Well, it's even a little broader than that, Brent. You're absolutely right in what you say. But understand this, there have been international intelligence reports that see evidence of Hezbollah funding for the illegal tobacco trade in Central America, in the United States, and in Canada, right along the St. Lawrence River. The notion that, buying cheap cigs at 20% the cost is a victimless crime is a very naive view. That money goes somewhere. And what I hear from our police and other forces is that the profits from that business, which are massive, often go to buy Canadian marijuana to ship into the United States and Central America for the purposes of buying coke and weapons to ship back into this country. And when you start talking about coke or Oxycontin or weapons in this country, you're not talking about victimless crimes anymore. You're talking about the victimization of young people, which is a very, very serious issue. So we have to connect the dots, in a sense, and be prudent and responsible in dealing with what that information gives us.
Folks, we're talking with Hugh Segal this afternoon. We're talking about his new book, of course, The Right Balance, and we're talking about all things Canadian. As I said at the outset, it's very nice, and I'm in a wonderful position to listen and be able to speak with people of great vision and passion, and certainly Hugh Segal is all of that. Hugh, we're going to have to start to wrap up now, but I'm going to ask you a final question, a question, of course, that I ask every guest that comes on this show. Imagine yourself at a podium with every single university student listening to you, and they're all asking for an A+. No, I'm kidding. What would you say to them?
I would say that their ability to build for themselves opportunities of great influence and impact in the private sector, in the not-for-profit sector, in government and politics is probably greater than it has ever been. And the reason is because of the digital world, because of the realities of digital democracy, that every student can be a publisher himself or herself from their desk or from their handheld event, in fact. The fact that they can have massive access now to information around the world. When I lecture at Queen's, and I'm talking about, the European community, I know that half my class on their laptops are engaging to see what the latest news on the European community, the euro, the bailouts issue, what that news is that day, that moment, up to date, something I could not do when I attended university. And the ability to mobilize folks behind a brand, behind a business idea, behind a political cause, has never been greater. And what I would say to students who are listening is sort out what you really believe in. What kind of contribution do you want to make? Is it in business? Is it in the not-for-profits? Is it in the professions? Is it in fighting for the oppressed in some way? Is it in leading a political party? Make that decision and then start to sort out the decisions in your life you need to do properly to make sure you have the capacity to make that contribution. And don't wait until you're out of university, and don't wait till you've had your first job or tried something for 5 years. Start thinking about it now. The other thing I'd say is the diversity of your experience. The more different things you do in different parts of life prepares you well for the kind of leadership that we need both in the private sector and the political sector. Just being narrowcast in one area all your life may be comfortable. It may be financially very, very rewarding, so I don't diminish it, but it doesn't give you the kind of breadth and reach that you really need to make a contribution that will inspire others and allow you to make the changes for a better world that I think most young Canadians really do want to make.
I think that's really inspiring and just perfect, a great way to end it. Hugh Segal, I want to thank you very much for coming on the show this afternoon. Once again, folks, www.brenthollandshow.com. Just click on the book cover called The Right Balance. That'll take you right to a place online where you can order it. I'm Brent Holland. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.